Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Opinion Machine, the show where we talk about all things gaming. My name is Killjoy, and today we're going to be talking about, or asking the question, is Metroid Dread a hard game? And it's something I've been seeing a lot online and thinking about myself, and you know, the topic of difficulty is always an interesting thing that pops up when it comes to video games. There's multi-parts to it, because there are so many things that can cause someone to have a difficult time playing a game, whether that be their own skill, the setup that they're currently using, mechanical difficulty, perceived difficulty. There's so many different parts of it that I find a really fascinating topic, but it's people, you know, go back and forth on what's hard, what's not, you know, the old get good meme and all that sort of stuff about this. But I've been thinking about this because Metroid Dread is still fresh in my mind. I still haven't started my hard mode run, but I do plan to. But I played for it twice, and during the second time I played through it, I found that I was just a lot better at the game and knew what to expect and, you know, how to handle those situations better. And it's one of those things, like with most video games, that when you pick up a game... Now, actually, before we get into that, bear in mind I have a lot of experience playing games. I wouldn't necessarily say that I am fantastic at all types of genres, but like platform games primarily have always been my kind of jam. I played, growing up, Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3 to death. Like, any kind of game that's kind of based around platforming and jumping, those are the games I usually, myself, I'm fairly confident at and fairly decent at. Obviously, not every platform handles the same, but generally speaking, if you give me a game that has a run and a jump button in it, like, it won't take me too long to kind of get to grips with it. Obviously, you have to fix, you know, there's how does the character on screen respond to your controls and how do they handle and stuff, and obviously that's different per game. But generally speaking, you give me that kind of game and I'm fairly decent at it, right? So when I'm going into a game like a Metroid game, Metroid Dread, or any kind of Metroid game, Samus's one of the main abilities is to run and jump, you know, so I've kind of got the idea down for like how to handle, you know, how the levels are designed, how the character moves on screen, all these sort of things. And someone who's played a lot of past Metroid games as well, I've already got a leg up on people that haven't played the game before, because I'm like, I know what these different things are on screen and what they're indicating. Like, this requires a different item I do not have right now. This requires you know, something to have changed in the world somewhere else for this thing to happen. And going in with that knowledge, having those experiences and taking my time, you know, to familiarize myself with the controls, I'm going in with an advantage over someone who's never played one of these games before, or may not have played that many platform games before. So from where I'm talking about difficulty perspective, and do I think this game's hard, you have to bear in mind that everybody is at a different skill level, and everybody is going to have a different background in gaming and what they're good at and what they're not good at. But having played the game through twice, there are a couple of things that make me like question if this game's actually hard, and it's also kind of not just for Dread, but for broader points for things like Dark Souls. And for other games that have that tagline of being difficult. There are a few things that I think that is massively important to you as a player to understand when you play these games, versus a game actually being cheap and making things very difficult for like for reasons that aren't, you know, just bad game design is probably the best way to describe it. So it's bad game design versus what is a game actually difficult is probably a good way of looking at it. So, the first thing you find with a lot of these games that are considered difficult is pattern recognition of enemies and bosses. And you are not, as a player, you are not expected to know how to deal with something when you go into a boss fight. In some circumstances, it's better to just keep moving around and figure things out before even attacking, simply so you understand how a boss works and what a boss does. And that is, you know, most people don't do that. They're like, oh, okay, I can see, like, you know, generally with a boss, when you hit a boss, it'll have a health bar or it'll flash. Those are like two of the most common ways of knowing that you are doing damage to a boss. In Dread, you shoot the weak point on an enemy boss and it flashes. So you're like, okay, I know I'm doing damage. a lot of those bosses require have readable moves. So the very first boss in Dread has this attack where it shoves its tail down into the ground. It kind of like wobbles and then comes down, and it has another attack where it will pull its tail back sort of behind it and then slash it forwards. Now both of those attacks are very readable. Going into the fight though, you're not entirely sure like what the range of those attacks is, how those attacks kind of work, and those are the mechanics you have to learn on the fly. And that's why sometimes it's good to sort of, you know, hang back from if you can, and learn what the attack patterns are. And those attack patterns are like one of the most commonly used things in most games. You see it in the game, any game with like large boss fights. You see it with things like Bayonetta, Dark Souls, and obviously Metroid Dread. The idea is that you can learn to read pattern recognition. And that's usually one of the biggest turn-offs for a lot of people, is that they go, oh god, this game's really hard. When in fact, you can probably beat the boss on your first go. You know, it should be possible that you can do that as a player. However, you know, the idea is that every time you attempt a boss and then you fail it, you have more information, and the game is trying to teach you that you have more and more information to deal with the obstacle that's put in front of you. And that's kind of one of those things where I look at it and go, is this actually hard? Is this actually badly designed? Are there parts in this, in Dread it specifically, where I'm like, okay, that feels a bit cheap, or like the window on this just feels a bit too small for the player to deal with. And only really in one circumstance in all of the bosses do I feel that there is a tiny window in one of the attacks where I'm like, okay, I wish that was a little bit easier to dodge. Obviously you learn, but that's probably the only time where I'm like, okay, this feels a bit cheap. And there's a boss later on in the game called Experiment like 97 or something, I can't remember what it is. And there's this ice breath that it lies on the floor, like it aligns. You can't jump into the breath anyway, and then it aligns this ice stuff on the floor, whatever it is. Now, at one point it will stop, and it'll give you just enough time to jump through it. The problem is the angle of which it then attacks from is a bit too unforgiving, because you think from what it's about to do, it looks like it's going to fire directly downward, but it will fire slightly to the left or slightly to the right of where it finished firing last time, and I think the window on that one definitely feels far too punishing. Every other attack in the game and that boss, completely reasonable, gives you plenty of time to deal with the obstacle thrown at you. That one you kind of learn that you've got to kind of stay nearish to the laser when he does it, and it's not that bad, but the actual timing on it and the angle at which it comes out it doesn't really line up with what's actually happening on screen as well as it could do. And so that particular part, I'm like, oh, okay, that's a bit frustrating, but it's only like that one move. Every other boss in this game, I feel like the attack patterns that they have are fairly readable, and most of the time they do the same sort of attack patterns in the same order. It's very rare that they will mix things up. So that's one thing, that's one of the three things I think. The second thing is understanding controls that the game is trying to get you to learn. In a game like Dread, you kind of have to use every button, and that is something that some people struggle with when, you know, games, especially when games made the jump to dual analog and started requiring people to use both. There's a lot of people I know that their parents stopped playing as many games because back in the day you had a D-pad and 2 buttons, you know, or it was a D-pad and 4 buttons. A lot of people just didn't have the coordination with dual analog. Now, in Dread, you have to think about certain combinations of buttons. If you want to aim and fire the grapple beam, that's 2 buttons. If you want to aim and fire a missile, that's 2 buttons. And then you don't want to accidentally switch them to the missile when you want to use a grappling beam. So there's a lot of like things to think about when playing this game. Now the controls themselves are silky smooth. The game handles amazingly well. But it is one of those things where this game demands that you understand how its controls work, especially because the better you understand those controls, the easier you will have of avoiding certain obstacles and being able to take shortcuts and things like that. A good example of this is being able to just insta-morph ball. If you just hold the button down while in the air, you'll just go into morph ball, so you can jump, morph ball, get into a gap quicker. And that's, like, to be fair, that's a bit more of an advanced skill on the when it comes to controls. It is a bit more advanced, But the game's trying to teach you, like, you know, experiment, play around with what you've got. You know, there's always something you're going to have on hand. And it's really interesting what you can do with the combination of buttons. As a new player, there's a lot of information to take in there. If you can understand the basic way that Samus moves in-game, and then once you get like more of the movement abilities and you spend time practicing those things, you'll nail it fairly easy. But there is that mechanical side of it with the controls that this isn't a game that has 2 buttons. This game has a lot of things for you to think about. You know, whether that's firing missiles, firing grappling beams, charge shots, flash shifting, going invisible. There's so much stuff here to remember, you know, and to use, and that's great. Like for people that are more advanced, that's fantastic. You're like, oh wow, I can do some really cool stuff with these abilities. But newer player, there's a lot of things to learn, and even I forgot to use half the abilities because I got so focused on how I would normally play. I'm like, oh wait, I've got options here. And the last thing I think, you know, comes down to difficulty is information in the world. How is the game teaching you how to deal with things throughout the entire time you're playing? You know, are you taking the time to learn about enemy patterns? Are there things in the world to say, hey, this is bad? You know, and they use Adam to say, don't go into cold areas, don't go into hot areas about certain things. So they do make a point of that. But does Dread do a good job of explaining to the player these things? And there are a lot of things in-game that help. If you know there's a room coming up that's like a fire room or an ice room, usually the door has got like sort of icy steam coming out of it, or like fire room, and the opposite was like fiery steam and stuff. So you kind of go, okay, yeah, that's teaching me that. You can spend time with the enemies, learning a lot of them just by, you know, watching how they move and things like that if you want. The game does what I think a fairly good job of trying to teach you everything the game's wanting you to learn. You know, there are some very old mechanics in there, like shooting random blocks and bombing walls. Like, as a Metroid veteran, you know all this stuff, you know how it works. As a newcomer, that's something you have to learn. Luckily, the game does give some minor tutorials at the beginning. Specifically says, like, there are stuff like this, so that's good. It's really interesting looking at difficulty in Dread, because there are parts of it that I think, yes, this game is a hard game. There are other parts of it where I'm like, you know what? I don't think this game is actually that hard. You know, the boss. Let's take the bosses out of the equation for a minute. We take the bosses out of the equation, and you're just using the exploration side of things with Dread and getting around the map and stuff. It's not necessarily that difficult. Yes, some of the enemies hit really hard. Yes, that they can be quite, you know, they can block your path, and you do have to learn. You have to know how to handle them. But a combination of pattern recognition, understanding and controls, and the information in the world the game's trying to give you, if all 3 of those things line up for you, you're going to have once you've learned it, you're going to have a fairly good time of getting through the game, especially on multiple, you know, consecutive playthroughs, because you know how to deal with things. And I quite like that about Dread. I like the fact that I went in blind, obviously with my own personal skill at these Metroid games. Kind of knew what to expect. Was surprised at the fact that, hey, Samus, in her current state, is quite weak due to what's happened to her. Enemies do hit hard, but you never ever don't have the tools to deal with every single enemy in the game. The counter is hugely powerful. Obviously it requires timing. It's not a answer to everything. There are some enemies you just don't want to get close to. Some enemies I don't even think you can counter. But you've got the long range stuff, you've got the close range stuff. Like the way that Samus is kitted out allows you to deal with many enemy types, or every enemy type. Once you start to understand and experience like how enemies work, the enemy placement, that side of things all starts to click together, and you're like, okay, this actually works pretty well. Every time you get upgrades, the game tells you, like, if you get like plasma beam, for example, it tells you you can now shoot mechanical enemies without having to use a missile or a charge shot on them. So that's the cool thing, and the game will constantly try and give you the information you need. Depends how much you want to read, really. One thing that is with the bosses that I found on my second playthrough was every boss has a countable attack. If you manage to counter those attacks, you will significantly speed up the boss fights. You will make it you'll do extra damage to them, and it'll make your life a lot easier. Now, obviously, those counter windows can vary. A lot of the time, the click noise that happens when they're going to counter happens, then they hang for a few seconds before they attack you, so you have to, like, learn it. But the second time I fought Kraid, on my second playthrough, absolutely smashed him. Because it was all just pattern recognition. It's like, right, he's going to do this, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, I'm going to do this. I'm going to counter him here, I'm going to unload missiles on him, rinse and repeat a second time, done. Like, no problem. And that's what's really interesting, is that this is a game that has a normal and a hard mode. I believe hard mode just means you take more damage. This is a game that is more punishing in the sense that you just take more damage generally, even on normal mode, which kind of works with what's going on with Samus in game anyway. And for newcomers to the game, it's going to feel incredibly brutal. But I don't know if that actually qualifies, like, this is what makes it interesting with this discussion, because does that qualify actually being a hard game? Because most people, if I was younger, say between the ages of 10 and 15, there is a good chance that I'd get fairly far into Dread, but I may not complete it. It's hard to say. I know what I was like back then, but, like, I would probably persevere because the game is kind of up my street. I probably would eventually beat it. But this is a game that's aimed at, like, 12-year-olds and upwards, and I don't think not to say that kids couldn't complete this game, but this game is going to feel very tough to people that do not have a lot of experience playing these type of games, right? And that seems like a really dumb thing to say, but if you go back and play other Metroid games, they don't feel as... You don't get as destroyed when you get hit by enemies. You take less damage a lot of the time. You know, Fusion, I remember being... you can lose health quite quickly in that game as well. But generally speaking, most Metroid games, you can tank quite a few hits before dying. It's never been to the point where you can tank a lot of hits, but it definitely feels like in Dread, you can maybe get hit, depending on the enemy type, a couple of times. Fall into lava with no health tank, you're pretty much dead at that point, because it will zap your health dry. But is the game difficult? I mean, I'm not, you know, at the end of the day, I don't think, me personally, like, I played it through twice, I'm like, you know what, I don't think this game is difficult, but it definitely has a challenge to it, and I enjoyed the challenge that it put in front of me. You know, it's the same with Dark Souls. However people react to those games, generally speaking, the Dark Souls games, there are a couple of moments that I personally think are cheap in those games, but generally they're well made, right? And the thing is, if you get on with the controls in those games, and you understand how the game wants you to play it, then is it actually difficult? A lot of it comes down to personal skill, right? If you have, you know, some kind of issue with your hands or certain types of controllers, like, that's obviously going to be a factor for sure. But I think having spent time thinking about this and walking away from it and eventually going back to do hard mode in Dread, that the game is a challenge, as it should be. Like, the game is constantly trying to teach you and make you better and better and better. But I don't know if I think it's, like, as hard as people make it out to be. I never felt like, I mean, apart from the final boss, I never really got, like, massively stuck anywhere, apart from getting lost on the map. I never felt that the boss fights were unfair. I never felt that the game was ever out of my control. And I completely appreciate that, you know, I'm saying this as somebody who has skill in games. But trying to be objective about it, like, yes, it's going to surprise people when they first play it. You know, standard enemies are going to dissolve your health if you're not careful. But is the game hard? I would say there's definitely hard moments in it, but I don't know if I don't know. It's weird. It's a strange one. I guess it just comes down to your personal preference. I think the game has a nice challenge to it, a nice difficulty curve, if you will. But is it like, oh my god, this game is so hard and brutal? It's definitely not a brutal game. You know, once you get at the points where it gets difficult in the game, you should have played long enough by that point to understand how the controls work and how the map, you know, how the game is trying to convey information to you. I still struggled on points. There are still parts of the game where I'm like, oof. You know, even on my second playthrough, dealing with the, what they call the robot Chozos, they always give me a hard time. But there's nothing there that I don't know how to deal with. It's just, I have to make sure that I'm paying attention to what its attack is. You do that and you use the abilities you hand, like, it's not too much of a problem. This isn't to take away from the fact that people are going to find this game hard, and if you find the game hard, like, that's totally cool. You know, I'm just trying to sit here and think about this game. Is it difficult? Is it a hard game? Or is it just the game is just trying to teach you constantly, like, hey, you've got abilities, learn how to use them. You know, a lot of the time it does just chuck you in the thick of it once you learn something, but it has its moments for sure. The final boss is definitely going to wreck many, many people. But overall, I think the game it has a nice curve to it. It never felt like it went super ragey, like I never had that with it. It never felt frustrating. So I guess rather than saying, is it a hard game, does it have a nice difficulty curve? And I think the answer is yes. Yes, it felt like Samus was always getting stronger, and so were the enemies. So that's kind of like my thoughts on it. Bit of a weird discussion today, but I kind of wanted to bring this up. I'm sure people are going to disagree and say, look, you know, it's hard. You know, I have no problem with difficulty modes. If they put in an easy mode, cool. I mean, you just half the damage you take, I guess, so you can tank more shots against the boss. Or you lower the health of the boss, or whatever. But yeah, I know people are going to disagree. I don't think most games that people say that are hard, and like a lot of it just comes down to learning and pattern recognition. You know, if I play Dark Souls, which I plan to at some point, I'm probably going to suck at it. But if I can just be patient enough to learn how things work, then it's going to go from being hard, quote unquote, to okay, I understand what this game wants me to do. It's just how the game works, kind of thing. So, yeah. Bit of a weird one today, but yeah, why not? Let's talk about difficulty, because that always sparks some interesting comments. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content like this, hit subscribe. Links for Facebook and Twitter will be down below in the description as always. And until next video, I will see you then.